Arab millionaire disguises himself as a driver to spy on his wife. What he uncovers will shock you. Hook. Imagine being at the top of the world. Wealth, success, everything you could ever want. But then you do something shocking. You disguise yourself as a driver to spy on your own wife. What happens next will leave you speechless and changed forever. Stick around until the end to discover the heartbreaking truth that will make even the strongest of us cry. Trust me, you won't see the twist coming. The darkened alley smelled of diesel and dust. Ahmed sat low in his car. The engine was quiet, almost dead. He wore a simple driver's uniform, the cap pulled low. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he didn't care. He had to see for himself. She had been acting different lately. The late nights, the texts, a glance at the rearview mirror. The mansion loomed in the distance. His heart pounded in his chest. Her silver car pulled out from the gates. The sound of its tires scraping the gravel sent a jolt through his body. He followed, staying a safe distance behind. The road stretched ahead, a dark ribbon under the night sky. Her car swerved slightly, as if she was lost in thought. Ahmed tightened his grip on the wheel. Where was she going? It wasn't like her to leave without saying anything. His breath grew shallow, quick. The city passed by in flashes of neon lights. Her car slowed as they approached a quiet street. A part of him wanted to turn back, to go home. But he couldn't. He had to know. She stopped in front of a building. It was tall, modern, but not familiar. The headlights from his car gleamed across the street. He pulled into a nearby lot, far enough to not be seen. His hands trembled as he reached for the door handle. He stepped out, barely making a sound. The cold night air bit at his skin. He moved swiftly, blending into the shadows. She got out of the car, looking around before heading inside. His heart raced faster now. Was she meeting someone? A sense of dread crawled up his spine. The building's glass doors slid open. For a moment, he stood frozen, watching her disappear. He had to go in. His feet moved of their own accord. He was already halfway to the door before he realized it. He pushed it open, stepping inside. The lobby was grand, sleek, with marble floors and silver accents. He paused, his senses on high alert. Footsteps echoed somewhere deeper inside. He was close now. The sound of voices filtered through the walls. He crept down the hallway, staying low. Then he heard her laughter. It was light, carefree, not like her usual tone. And it wasn't the sound of laughter he recognized. His stomach dropped. A man's voice joined hers, low, comforting. He couldn't make out the words, but the warmth in her voice made his chest ache. He took another step, straining to hear. The laughter faded, replaced by a soft murmur. And then the sound of a kiss. Ahmed froze, his world crashing around him. He staggered back, his hand gripping the wall for support. His mind spun. How could she? How long had this been going on? He felt his chest tighten, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. With shaking hands, he stumbled back toward the door. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Outside, the night air hit him like a slap. The city lights blurred around him. His thoughts were a whirlpool. He walked aimlessly, not knowing where he was going. Everything he had built, everything he thought he knew, shattered in an instant. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the tears welling up. The tears stung, but he didn't wipe them away. The cold air seemed to slice through him, but it couldn't cut through the suffocating weight in his chest. His steps were slow, deliberate, though his mind was a mess. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what to do. The night was endless. Each footstep felt heavier than the last. His car was parked up ahead, but he didn't feel like getting in. The engine, the leather seats, the familiar hum, it all felt distant now. He stopped on the sidewalk, staring at the city around him. Everything seemed so fake. His eyes traced the distant skyline, the glowing billboards, the wealth, the luxury, the life he had built. It all seemed hollow. He had everything, but none of it mattered. The mansion, the cars, the jets. None of it mattered if she didn't care. His mind raced back to the sound of her laughter, the kiss, the warmth in her voice. It wasn't him she had been sharing that with. It wasn't him who had made her smile like that. He wanted to scream, to break something, but the anger wasn't there. Instead, an aching emptiness filled him, swallowing everything else. The tears came freely now. They burned as they fell. He didn't care who saw. The world had fallen away, and all that was left was the raw, painful truth. He had trusted her, believed in her. But she had betrayed him in the deepest way possible. The man she was with, who was he? What had she told him about her life? What had he told her? A bitter laugh escaped his lips. This was his life now. Nothing was real. He turned around, heading back toward his car. Every step felt like an eternity. Once inside, he slammed the door shut, the sound echoing in the empty space. The interior lights flickered on, casting a cold glow. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The engine roared to life, but his mind was numb. His hand gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. He didn't know where to go, but he drove anyway. The city blurred past him in the headlights. His thoughts scattered in 1,000 directions. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, it all mixed into one, thick and suffocating. And as the miles passed, a question echoed in his mind. What now? What was he supposed to do with this broken, shattered version of his life? There was no answer. Only the silence and the weight of what he had just discovered. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. The car hummed steadily beneath him, but the world outside felt cold and distant. Ahmed's hands were still tight on the wheel, but his grip was slowly slipping. He wasn't sure how much longer he could drive like this, lost in his own thoughts. His mind kept returning to her, to the way she had smiled, the way her voice had trembled with excitement. He thought about the man. Who was he? Had he been there all along? Ahmed's breath quickened. The thought twisted in his gut like a knife. What had gone wrong? He tried to recall the last time they had laughed together, the last time they'd been close. But the memory felt faded, like a dream he couldn't fully hold on to. The weight in his chest grew heavier. The roads blurred, the streetlights flickering past him like fading stars. The tears still burned, but now they were quiet, swallowed by the deep ache inside him. Everything he had worked for, all the sacrifices, had been for nothing. His vision started to swim, the edges of the world turning soft. He needed to stop. The car swerved, and for a brief moment, he thought he was going to crash. But he didn't. Somehow, he regained control, but the tremors in his hands never stopped. He pulled into a small park, far from the bustle of the city. It was quiet here. Too quiet. The sounds of the night surrounded him, but they felt distant, as if muffled by the storm brewing inside his head. He killed the engine, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Ahmed leaned back in his seat, staring at the empty sky. It was all too much. The betrayal, the pain, the disbelief. His life, the perfect facade he had built, was falling apart. How could he have missed it? His mind played back every conversation, every glance. What did he miss? What were the signs? But the answers only led to more questions. He sat there for what felt like hours, alone in the dark. The night seemed to stretch on forever. And still, the weight in his chest didn't ease. He wasn't sure if he was angry anymore. He wasn't sure of anything. But as he sat there, the tears finally came again. This time, they weren't just for the woman who had betrayed him. They were for the life he had lost, for the future he would never have, for the love he thought was real. And yet, in the quiet, under the weight of his sorrow, a single thought crept in. What if she never loved me at all? The question hung in the air unanswered. As he sat in the dark, broken, the minutes ticked by like hours. But the silence didn't change. Ahmed sat, staring at nothing, consumed by the question. What if she never loved me at all? His chest tightened, suffocating under the weight of that thought. It felt like the ground beneath him was slipping away, like he was losing his grip on everything that had once been solid. The city was far off now, just a distant hum in the background. He was alone, utterly alone. He ran a hand through his hair, pushing it back as if trying to clear his thoughts. But nothing came, nothing but the cold, biting reality of betrayal. The man's voice echoed in his mind, soft, soothing, a contrast to the anger and rage that boiled inside of him. Who was he? What did he have that Ahmed didn't? The questions came faster now, each one more painful than the last. He had given her everything. He had sacrificed so much. And she had thrown it all away. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, had walked away from him. For someone else. A shiver ran down his spine. It was unbearable. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. A horn honked somewhere in the distance, sharp and jarring, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. He blinked, disoriented for a moment. His surroundings were quiet again, still. But now, something had shifted within him. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay lost in this brokenness. He couldn't let her win. Letting out a slow, steadying breath, he reached for the door handle. His body moved on autopilot, each step weighed down by exhaustion, pain, and confusion. But there was something else now, something stirring beneath the surface. A need to confront the truth, to face what had been done to him, to find answers. He walked to the edge of the park, where the trees swayed in the wind, their leaves rustling softly. It felt like nature was mocking him. Everything around him was alive, moving, and yet he was still, frozen in his grief. But as he stood there, the idea took shape in his mind. He couldn't go back to the mansion, not now, not yet. But there was one place left, one person who might have answers. His breath hitched at the thought. The man she had been with. Ahmed had to find him. He had to know who he was, and then he would know what to do. With a heavy heart, he turned and started walking, the pain of every step echoing in his mind. But there was no turning back now. He had come this far, and now he would face whatever came next. The night air was thick with tension as Ahmed's footsteps quickened. His mind raced, each thought sharp and frenzied. The man, the one who had stolen her heart, her laughter, the one who had shattered his world. He couldn't just let it go. He had to know. His body moved almost mechanically, driven by a force he couldn't explain. The city streets were quiet now, the usual hum of traffic gone, replaced by the sound of his hurried footsteps. A streetlight flickered above him, casting strange, jagged shadows on the sidewalk. It felt like the world was closing in around him. The building where he had seen her earlier was still fresh in his mind. He remembered the tall glass doors, the sleek, modern design, the laughter, the kiss. The memory twisted in his gut, nausea rising with every thought of her in someone else's arms. He reached the building, and his heart skipped a beat. It loomed ahead, cold and imposing. There was no sign of anyone nearby. No guards, no workers. It was late, but still, the emptiness made his skin crawl. He walked up to the door, his hand resting against the cool glass. It felt wrong, trespassing into this unknown world of hers. But he didn't care anymore. He pushed the door open with a steady hand. The lobby was as immaculate as he remembered, though now it felt suffocating, alien. He couldn't just turn around now, couldn't let fear stop him. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any hint, any trace of where she had gone. Nothing. Just the cold, polished floors and the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Then he spotted something. A door at the far end of the room, half open. Voices filtered through. He moved toward it, his pulse pounding in his ears. Each step felt heavier, closer, and then the unmistakable sound of her voice. It was softer this time, but still unmistakable. She was speaking to someone. The man. Ahmed's hand clenched into a fist, the nails biting into his palm. His heart raced, each beat like a drum, loud in the quiet of the building. He leaned in closer, the door barely open enough to see inside. Through the crack, he could see her face. Her eyes were closed, her lips parting in a slow, deliberate kiss. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a kiss. It was something more, something real. Her hands were tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. A deep ache spread through Ahmed's chest. A pain so sharp, it nearly took his breath away. And then he saw the man who had stolen her from him. Tall, with dark hair and sharp features. There was something familiar about him, but Ahmed couldn't place it. His face was unreadable, but his hands were all over her, as if he had every right to be there. Ahmed's stomach twisted violently. The man leaned in closer, his mouth brushing against her neck. And that was when it hit him. The man was someone he knew. Someone from his past. Someone from his business dealings. The thought was like a punch to the gut. His mind raced back, trying to piece it together. It was impossible. No, it couldn't be. But there he was. The same man who had attended his business meetings. The same man who had congratulated him on his success. The same man who had shaken his hand like a trusted partner. How could I not have seen this? Ahmed's body went cold, his knees weakening as the weight of the realization crashed down on him. This wasn't just betrayal. This was calculated. This was deliberate. His breath grew shallow. And suddenly, the world felt too small, too confined. He couldn't stay here any longer. He couldn't watch this. He turned quickly, retreating from the door. The reality was too much, too raw, and as he stumbled back into the lobby, everything in him screamed to leave. But one thought kept hammering through his mind. Why? Why her? Why this man? What had he done wrong? His mind swirled with the same question over and over. Why? He couldn't escape it, couldn't outrun the gnawing doubt. As he moved through the lobby, the sterile lights above flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. The coldness of the building pressed in on him, each step feeling heavier than the last. He didn't even know where he was going anymore. The pain of betrayal had become a relentless ache, seeping deeper with every passing second. Outside, the night seemed so much darker, colder. The world felt as though it had turned on him. His legs moved on their own as he made his way back to his car, but his thoughts were trapped in the building, locked in that moment with him. He had known this man for years, had trusted him as a partner, even as a friend. How could he have been so blind? How could he not have seen it? His hands gripped the steering wheel once more, the leather cool beneath his palms. The car engine hummed to life, but it was drowned out by the storm raging in his chest. He needed answers. He needed to confront this, to face the truth head-on. The question kept echoing in his head, a dark drumbeat. Why? The drive felt endless, though the streets passed by in flashes of dim light and shadows. Ahmed didn't know where he was headed, just that he couldn't stay where he was. He pulled into the parking lot of a familiar building, one he'd visited 1,000 times before. It was his business headquarters, but tonight it felt like a prison. He had no plan, no clear course of action, but he had to do something. He couldn't just let this go. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, the soft click of his shoes against the concrete echoing in the empty lot. The building loomed before him, dark and silent. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle. He stepped inside, but the usual hum of activity was gone. The lights were off, the air stale and heavy. It felt abandoned, even though it wasn't. He moved through the halls with purpose, each step a little more desperate than the last. And then he saw the figure at the end of the corridor. It was him, the man from earlier, the man who had stolen her from him, the man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. He was standing there, leaning against the wall, his eyes dark and unreadable. Ahmed's heart skipped a beat. The man pushed off from the wall slowly, like he knew exactly what was about to happen. There was no surprise in his expression, no guilt, just cold indifference. "Ahmed," he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I was wondering when you'd show up." The words cut through the silence like a blade. "Why?" Ahmed choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Why her? Why me?" The man didn't flinch. He just looked at Ahmed, his eyes filled with a cold, unsettling calm. "You were never enough for her," the man said, his words slicing through the air. "She needed more. She deserves more." A fire ignited in Ahmed's chest, fury and confusion mixing into one searing heat. "I gave her everything," Ahmed shouted, his voice raw. "Everything." The man's eyes narrowed, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You thought you did, but you didn't. You couldn't. Not like I can." The words hit harder than any punch could. Ahmed felt like the ground had dropped out from under him. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists, the urge to lash out overwhelming. But the man simply stepped back, his expression unreadable. And then, in the silence that followed, he spoke again. "She wanted freedom," he said quietly, "and she wanted someone who could give her that. Someone who wasn't shackled by fear or pride." The weight of his words landed like a crushing blow. Fear, pride. Had that been the problem? Ahmed didn't know what to feel anymore. He had been blind, lost in his own world, too busy to see what had been right in front of him. But now, standing here with this man, the man who had taken everything, a part of him wanted to fight, to demand answers. But another part of him just felt hollow, empty. "Is that all I was to her?" Ahmed finally whispered, his voice breaking. "A cage." The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was already clear. The silence hung thick between them, heavy and suffocating. Ahmed's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight, with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The man stood there, his presence cold and unwavering, like a specter in the shadows. But Ahmed was breaking. The crushing weight of betrayal pressed against him, and the pain was unbearable. "I loved her," Ahmed said, his voice a mere whisper. "And she loved me, too. Didn't she?" The man's eyes flickered, a momentary hesitation. But then that cruel smile reappeared, his eyes hardening once more. "She loved you. But she needed more than just love, Ahmed. She needed to be free. And you were never going to let her be that." The words stung. They cut deeper than anything physical ever could. The man stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "You built a life around control, power, wealth. But you never gave her what she truly wanted, freedom. You thought that by giving her everything, you'd keep her. But you were wrong." Ahmed's fists tightened until his nails dug into his palms. He couldn't understand, couldn't wrap his mind around it. How could everything he had worked for, everything he had given her, amount to nothing? His throat tightened, and for the first time since he had seen her earlier, he felt truly empty. The world around him felt distant, blurry, like he was drifting further and further away from reality. "You think you know her," the man continued, his voice almost condescending, "but you don't. You never did. And now she's free. With me." The words were like a slap, each one landing harder than the last. Ahmed swallowed, struggling to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to overtake him. "I should hate you," he muttered, barely able to keep his voice steady. "I should destroy you." The man raised an eyebrow, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You can try," he said, his tone mocking, "but it won't change anything." Ahmed stood there, rooted to the spot, torn between rage and a deep, aching sadness. What was left for him now? What could he do? "I loved her," he repeated, the words sounding empty even as he said them. But the man's face remained unreadable, and that truth, the one that had been sinking in ever since he'd discovered what was happening, hit him once more. It didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. He had lost. Ahmed turned away, his steps slow and unsteady as he walked back toward the exit. His heart weighed so heavily in his chest, it felt like it might tear apart. But as he reached the door, something inside him cracked, splintered. He was done. Done with the lies. Done with the illusions. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't undo what had already been done. With each step toward the outside, he felt more like a ghost. The cold air hit him as he stepped back into the night, but it didn't offer any relief. The city around him, once vibrant and full of possibility, now seemed cold and empty. It was all gone. Everything he had built. Everything he had sacrificed. The pain surged again, but now there was nothing left to fight for. He had nothing. Nothing but the ache of knowing she was gone. She was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. And as the cold night enveloped him, Ahmed couldn't help but ask himself again, why? But there was no answer. Not anymore. The city stretched out before him, a blur of lights and shadows. But it felt as if he were looking at it from another world. Everything had lost its meaning. His footsteps echoed in the empty street, sharp and hollow, like the sound of his own heart breaking. He couldn't think straight, couldn't process it all. "She's gone," the words repeated in his mind, each time harder to bear. The world felt unbearably cold now, the warmth of his old life slipping through his fingers like sand. The car sat in the parking lot, a silent witness to his descent into this emptiness. He didn't get in, not yet. Instead, he walked aimlessly, letting his feet take him wherever they wanted. The sky above him was dark, endless, filled with nothing but cold stars. He had once believed in destiny, in fate, in the notion that everything had a purpose. But now, standing here in the silence, the only thing that felt real was the pain in his chest. It was all he had left. His thoughts, scattered and jagged, dragged him through a labyrinth of confusion and despair. Why didn't I see it? What happened to us? His mind flashed back to the beginning, to the first time they met. Her smile, her laughter, the way she had looked at him like he was everything. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. He had been blind to it, too caught up in the life he had built, too consumed by his own success. He hadn't noticed when she began to slip away. He hadn't noticed the cracks in their relationship until they were too wide to ignore. And now she was gone, not just physically, but emotionally. The man, he had taken her in ways Ahmed never could have. She had craved freedom, he now realized. Freedom from the walls Ahmed had built around them. And in her eyes, he had failed her. He had failed them both. The tears he had been holding back finally surfaced, hot and unrelenting. He didn't care who saw. There was no one around. The world felt like a distant memory, as though it didn't belong to him anymore. His heart shattered as he collapsed against a nearby bench, the cold would pressing into his legs. It was too much to carry, too much to hold. And as he sat there, staring into the empty space ahead, the weight of it all settled in. His wealth, his status, his power, none of it mattered. She was gone, and nothing could bring her back. He had given her everything, but he hadn't given her what she needed. He hadn't given her freedom. The night stretched on, deep and unyielding, and in the silence, Ahmed let the truth sink in. And somehow, in the midst of all that pain, a new thought began to form. It was over. There was no going back. He couldn't fix what had been broken, but maybe, just maybe, he could learn to move forward. Though it felt impossible now, he would have to find a way. And as the tears dried, he slowly stood up. The weight of the broken man he had become heavy on his shoulders. But even broken, he would keep walking. Even broken, he would find his way. The night felt endless, stretching out like a black void that seemed to swallow every ounce of hope. Ahmed's legs were stiff, but he forced himself to move, each step a reminder of the weight he carried. His mind was clouded, torn between the agony of the past few hours and the overwhelming sense of emptiness that had settled inside him. He walked without purpose, as if the very ground beneath his feet could lead him to something, anything that might dull the ache in his chest. But there was nothing. No answers, no solutions, no relief. He didn't know where he was going, nor did he care. The city had become a maze, a blur of lights and sounds that meant nothing to him anymore. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to hear voices that reminded him of the life he had lost. Minutes stretched into hours, the cold night air biting at his skin, but the chill on the outside couldn't compare to the frost that had settled deep within him. His thoughts wandered back to her, to the way she had looked at him that final time, to the way she had smiled, and yet he hadn't seen the truth in her eyes. He hadn't seen the longing, the escape. She hadn't just walked away from him. She had walked away from everything that had kept her bound by his side. Her own freedom. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had been blinded by his own pride, by the belief that he could control everything, even her. He hadn't understood her needs, hadn't understood the weight of her quiet frustration. And now, in the silence of the night, it was too late to fix it. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She had given him a choice years ago. She had asked for freedom, asked for space to breathe, to grow, and he had failed to hear it. He had smothered her with everything he thought she needed, when what she needed was to feel alive, to feel free. But now she was with someone else. And the man, the one who had shown her that freedom, wasn't someone Ahmed could fight with wealth or power. He had nothing left to offer. The thought struck him with the finality of a hammer. And for the first time, he felt his grip on everything begin to slip. What was left for him? What was left after all the betrayal? After all the lies? There was nothing left. His steps slowed, and he finally stopped, staring out at the distant horizon, where the first signs of dawn began to creep into the sky. It was still dark, still cold, but in the faint glow of the early morning light, Ahmed felt something stir inside him, a fragile thread of determination. He didn't know where to go from here, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep running from himself. He couldn't keep drowning in his pain. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the darkness, he stood up straighter. It wasn't over, not yet. There were no more illusions, no more masks to hide behind. But maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild. Not the life he had lost, but a new life. A life that was his own. A life that wasn't defined by the past. And so, for the first time that night, Ahmed took a deep breath. And he started walking with no destination, but with a single quiet hope. The hope that one day he would find himself again. The morning light grew stronger, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. The streets ahead were still empty, but they no longer felt as suffocating. For the first time in hours, the air seemed less oppressive. It was as though the very dawn had cracked open a door that had been closed for far too long. He didn't know what he was searching for anymore. His life had been built on so many illusions, wealth, control, power, things that had meant everything until this moment, until she had walked away. But as he kept walking, each step felt more grounded, less lost. It wasn't much, but it was something. He paused in front of a small cafe, the warm glow inside offering a stark contrast to the chill of the morning outside. The world was waking up, life moving on, and he, too, had to find a way to keep moving. The door to the cafe opened, and a young woman walked out, smiling at someone inside. She paused when she saw him, her gaze flickering with recognition. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle but unsure, as if she could sense the weight he carried. Ahmed looked at her, unsure how to answer. He wasn't sure he had an answer himself, but the question lingered, hanging in the air between them. "Not yet," he said quietly, "but I will be." He turned away before she could say more, stepping back into the street. The day had begun, and so, too, must he begin again. With every step, he knew that there was no going back to what he had lost. But as the world around him started to come alive, he felt something stirring deep inside him, a sense of hope that had been buried for far too long. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It wasn't about erasing the pain. But somehow, he knew that the journey ahead, however uncertain, would be his own. And for the first time in a long while, that thought didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with something else, a quiet, flickering spark. The journey wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. And with that, he kept walking, the future unfolding before him. One step at a time, the path ahead was uncertain. But the weight on his chest had begun to lift, ever so slightly. Each step felt like a small, fragile promise to himself. The world around him seemed to move in slow motion as he walked. The streets were beginning to fill with life. People hurrying to work, the hum of cars, the distant sound of laughter. But for the first time, none of it felt suffocating. He was just one small part of it all now. No longer trapped by the expectations he had once placed on himself, or the control he had clung to so desperately. His mind kept drifting back to her, the memory of her smile, the sound of her voice, but it didn't hurt as much anymore. The sharp edges of the pain had dulled, and for the first time in weeks, he could breathe without feeling like he was suffocating. Maybe this was the first step toward something real, something not defined by wealth or power, but by the choices he would make now. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing: he couldn't keep holding on to the past. He had to let it go, piece by piece. And so, without a clear destination in mind, Ahmed wandered through the city, letting his feet guide him. Eventually, he found himself in a small park, the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. There was a bench beneath a large oak, and without thinking, he sat down. The park was quiet, almost peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ahmed allowed himself to simply be, to exist without the pressure of expectations, without the weight of the past. He closed his eyes just for a moment and took in the sounds of the park, the rustling leaves, the faint chirping of birds in the distance, the soft murmur of voices in the background. It was nothing extraordinary, but in that moment, it felt like enough. He was enough. When he opened his eyes again, a man approached. He was older, with graying hair and a gentle smile. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, his voice kind but not intrusive. Ahmed glanced up, and for some reason he didn't feel the need to say no. "Of course," he said, moving slightly to give the man space. The man sat down, and for a few moments, they both simply sat in silence, the peacefulness of the park wrapping around them. Finally, the man spoke again. "I've seen that look before," he said, his voice soft but knowing. That look of someone who's lost, but still searching. Ahmed turned to him, slightly surprised. "And what would you know about it?" he asked, almost without thinking. The man chuckled, his eyes twinkling with something unspoken. "I know because I've been there," he said simply. "We all have, at some point. The trick is to keep moving, even when you don't know where you're going, even when it hurts." Ahmed studied him, feeling a strange sense of understanding, even though he had just met this man. "And what if it feels like there's nothing left to move toward?" Ahmed asked, his voice tinged with a vulnerability he hadn't felt in years. The man's smile softened. "Then you move toward yourself," he said quietly. "Sometimes that's all we can do. And in time, the path will become clear." Ahmed didn't know why, but something about the man's words resonated deep within him. Maybe it was the honesty in his voice. Maybe it was the quiet wisdom in his eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever understand everything that's happened," Ahmed said, his voice barely a whisper. The man nodded, his expression unshaken. "Not all things are meant to be understood, my friend. Some things just are. You have to find peace with that." There was a long pause, and then the man stood, giving Ahmed a gentle nod before walking away. Ahmed watched him go, feeling an unexpected sense of peace wash over him. The man's words echoed in his mind, a quiet reassurance that perhaps he didn't need all the answers right now. Maybe the only thing he needed to do was keep walking, keep moving forward, even when the road wasn't clear. The future was still a mystery, but the present this moment was his, and maybe that was enough for now. With a deep breath, Ahmed stood up, feeling lighter than he had in days, perhaps even weeks. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. Ahmed walked through the park, the cool breeze ruffling his hair. The city around him hummed with life, but he felt detached from it all, as if the world were unfolding in front of him, and he was just another spectator. But it didn't bother him as much as it used to. In fact, there was a strange kind of peace in it. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to rush. He didn't feel the suffocating pressure to achieve, to succeed, to control every single outcome. His mind was quiet, and for once, it wasn't a painful silence. He glanced at the sun rising higher in the sky. The day was beginning, and he was too. As his footsteps carried him further into the city, he passed by familiar streets, familiar buildings, all of them once part of the life he had carefully constructed. But now they felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. He could still see the life he had once known, but the weight of it had lifted. The burden of his past, the loss, the regret, it wasn't gone, but it wasn't consuming him anymore. He stopped in front of a small, nondescript building, one he hadn't thought about in years. It was an old bookstore, the kind that looked like it had stood still in time. The windows were foggy, and the shelves inside seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten stories. Something about it felt comforting. Before he even realized what he was doing, his hand reached for the door. It opened with a creak, and the smell of old paper and leather filled the air. The inside was dimly lit, a soft, warm glow coming from the flickering lights overhead. Rows upon rows of books surrounded him, their spines cracked, their pages yellowing. He wandered through the aisles, running his fingers along the books, feeling their weight, their history. He wasn't sure why he was here, but something about the quiet stillness of the space called to him. As he turned a corner, his eyes fell on a small, unmarked book tucked away on a shelf. Without thinking, he pulled it out. The cover was worn, faded from years of handling, but the title was still legible, The Art of Letting Go. He flipped through the pages, each one filled with delicate writing, reflections on loss, grief, and healing. It felt like a sign, a quiet reminder, a nudge to move forward, a message to release the weight he had been carrying. He glanced around the store. There was no one else in sight, just the quiet hum of the world outside, and the silence within the walls of this sanctuary. For a moment, he allowed himself to sink into the solitude, just breathing, just being. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to have it all figured out. In the pages of that book, he found something he hadn't expected. Acceptance. Acceptance of his past, of the mistakes, of the pain, and a realization that maybe it wasn't about finding a specific path forward. Maybe it was about learning to live with the unknown, to let go of the things he couldn't control. The book felt heavy in his hands, but not in a bad way. It was as if it was offering him a kind of permission, a quiet invitation to let go. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the counter. The woman behind it was older, with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. Ahmed hesitated, looking at the book in his hands. "Maybe," he said quietly. "I think I found something more important." She nodded slowly, as if she understood, and smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's all you can hope for," she said. With that, he turned and walked out, the bell above the door ringing softly as it closed behind him. The city seemed brighter now, the sun higher in the sky, its warmth spreading through the streets. Ahmed didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel afraid. He was starting to understand. It wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about controlling the future. It was about learning to let go of the anger, of the guilt, of the need for answers. And with each step, as he walked away from the bookstore, he felt lighter. A small, fragile hope flickered within him. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to move forward. The world felt different now. The sunlight seemed softer, warmer. Ahmed's footsteps were steady, grounded, each one carrying him further away from the past he had been clinging to for so long. The bookstore and its quiet, wise owner had offered him more than just a moment of solace. They had given him the space to breathe, to remember what it meant to simply exist, without the weight of expectations pushing down on him. As he walked through the streets, he noticed things he hadn't before. The way the leaves danced in the wind, the laughter of children playing in the park, the small moments of life that had always been there, but that he had never seen. He had been too consumed by the chaos of his own mind, too obsessed with controlling the uncontrollable. But now, with each step, it was as if the world was gently reminding him that not everything needed to be figured out. Some things were simply meant to be lived. Ahmed didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need them anymore. His path wasn't clear, but he wasn't searching for clarity in the same way anymore. He had learned in those quiet pages of the book that it was okay not to know. It was okay to let things unfold in their own time. And the more he let go, the lighter he felt. He passed familiar buildings, once symbols of success and power, now just part of the landscape. It was strange how distant they felt, how unimportant they seemed now. The wealth, the influence, they were no longer the markers of his identity. It was the simple, quiet moments that mattered more now. The connections, the freedom to exist without the chains of the past. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from a number he didn't recognize. Asterisk Ahmed, we need to talk. It's about her. Asterisk. His heart skipped a beat, the old panic rising in his chest. For a moment he hesitated. The need to control the situation, to fix things, to get answers surged inside him. But then he remembered. He remembered the quiet wisdom of the bookstore, the woman's words. Sometimes things were not meant to be fixed. Sometimes they were just meant to be left alone. He stared at the message, his fingers hovering over the screen. It would be so easy to reply, to demand answers, to drag the past back into the present. But as he stood there in the middle of the busy street, the noise of the world around him, he felt something shift inside. He didn't need answers. Not anymore. He didn't need to chase her, or the past. He had already lost them both, and no amount of control, no amount of questioning could change that. With a deep breath, he put the phone back in his pocket. He was done chasing. The journey ahead was his to define now, and it started with letting go. Ahmed continued walking, his pace steady, no longer in a hurry to arrive at anything. For the first time in a long time, he was simply living, and that, he realized, was enough. The day stretched out before him, an open canvas, each step a brushstroke toward a future he could no longer predict, but that he could shape in his own way. For the first time in ages, Ahmed felt the grip of uncertainty loosen. It was an unfamiliar sensation, but not unwelcome. He passed through the city, no longer rushing, just existing in the flow of it. The hum of life around him became a comforting backdrop to his thoughts. People walked past him, their lives unfolding in their own quiet ways, just as his was. He didn't have to be anyone else anymore. He didn't have to prove anything. The years of living in the shadow of expectation, in the constant pursuit of more, felt like another life, distant and fading. As he wandered, the edges of his mind cleared. He could feel the weight of the past receding, the anger, the betrayal, the disappointment. They didn't vanish, but they didn't drown him anymore. They simply became part of his story, but not the whole story. He was writing the next chapter, and it was his to craft. Ahmed eventually found himself at the river that ran through the city. The water moved swiftly, effortlessly, flowing without concern for the obstacles in its path. He stood there, watching the ripples dance across the surface, the light of the afternoon sun reflecting off the water in scattered patterns. He thought back to her, to all the things he had done wrong, but he didn't feel the same rush of anger anymore. The sting had faded into something else, something quieter, almost peaceful. She had needed freedom, he thought again, and for the first time, the truth didn't hurt. It was just a fact. He had tried to give her everything, but hadn't realized she needed more than his version of love. She needed space to be herself, to live on her own terms. Ahmed exhaled, the weight in his chest easing further. There was no point in holding on to the past. No point in searching for answers that would never come. He had to let go. He was learning how, little by little, day by day, a voice interrupted his thoughts. Beautiful view, isn't it? Ahmed turned and saw an older man standing beside him. His face was weathered, but his smile was genuine warm. He was holding a fishing rod, and his eyes gleamed with a quiet, knowing wisdom. Ahmed nodded, offering a faint smile in return. "It is," he said, his voice soft. "You seem lost in thought," the man observed, his tone light but perceptive. Ahmed chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe just trying to find my way." The man nodded as if he understood, as if that was something everyone had to do at some point in their life. "You know," the man said, "life's a lot like fishing. You can spend all your time chasing after the perfect catch, but sometimes you just have to wait, let the water do its thing, and see what comes your way." Ahmed considered this, the simplicity of the words settling over him like a gentle breeze. "Not everything needs to be caught," the man continued, casting his line into the river with a practiced flick of his wrist. "Sometimes you just have to let it flow, let it go where it will." Ahmed stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of the water, watching the man settle into the rhythm of his fishing. For the first time in a long while, he felt an unexpected peace. Maybe life wasn't about the chase. Maybe it wasn't about control. Maybe it was about learning to let go, to let life move and shape itself, instead of clinging to every moment, every person, every outcome. The man was right. There was a quiet beauty in simply being, in simply allowing things to unfold, without fear or resistance. Ahmed glanced at the man again, offering a small, genuine smile. "Thank you," he said softly. The man looked back at him and nodded. "You'll find your way, son. Just don't try to force it. Sometimes the best things come when you stop trying so hard." With that, the man returned to his fishing, his eyes focused on the water, his presence a quiet reassurance. Ahmed didn't know what came next, and that was okay. For the first time, he was at peace with the uncertainty. He turned and walked away, the soft, steady rhythm of his steps echoing in the silence. The city around him was still alive, but now it felt less overwhelming. The future was still a mystery, but Ahmed knew one thing for sure. He was ready to live it. Ahmed's steps grew more deliberate as he walked away from the river, the weight in his heart lighter with each passing moment. The man's words echoed in his mind, each one settling like a quiet truth that he hadn't known he needed to hear. Don't try to force it. It was strange how simple it sounded, yet how profound it felt. He had spent so much time trying to control everything, to mold his life and his future into something that made sense. But now, in the quiet of the city and the stillness of the river, he realized that perhaps the best things in life couldn't be planned. They just had to unfold, piece by piece, in their own time. The bustling streets of the city began to feel less like a cacophony and more like the background to his own personal journey. People hurried past, going about their daily lives, but he no longer felt compelled to be a part of their rush. For the first time in years, Ahmed felt as though he could simply be no expectations, no deadlines, no pressure. He found himself at the foot of a quiet hill, one he hadn't noticed before, not in the midst of his previous chaos. It was small, barely visible amidst the larger buildings, but it beckoned to him in a way that felt familiar. Without thinking, he began the slow climb up the hill, each step a gentle effort, no rush, no hurry. The soft rustling of leaves in the breeze was the only sound, and as he reached the top, he stopped to catch his breath. The view from the hilltop took him by surprise. The city sprawled out beneath him, the mix of old and new architecture a patchwork of history and progress. The river wound through the landscape, a gentle reminder of time's passing. For a moment, Ahmed simply stood there, breathing in the cool air, feeling the weight of the world shift. He had thought he needed to conquer it all, to control every aspect of his life, but now, in the stillness, he understood. Maybe he wasn't meant to conquer anything. Maybe he was just meant to live. As he gazed out over the city, something shifted within him. He realized that, despite the pain and the loss, he had learned something invaluable. He had learned that life wasn't about having all the answers, about winning every battle or fixing every mistake. It was about accepting the things he couldn't change and finding peace in the moments that truly mattered. The city was vast, the future uncertain, but Ahmed no longer felt afraid. He was beginning to see it differently. The journey, he realized, was the destination, and it was enough. He sat down on a nearby bench, taking in the view, watching as the sunlight began to fade into the evening sky. There were no grand epiphanies, no dramatic revelations, just a quiet sense of peace. He could still hear the distant hum of the city, but it didn't feel overwhelming anymore. It felt like part of the whole, a piece of the puzzle he was slowly fitting together. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, he allowed himself to simply be in that moment, not chasing anything, not running from anything, just being. There were still unanswered questions, still things left to resolve. But now, he could face them with a kind of quiet confidence, knowing that the answers would come when the time was right. He didn't need to force it. He didn't need to control it. For the first time, he was okay with the unknown, and that in itself was enough. The night began to settle over the city, and Ahmed remained on the bench, the cool air brushing against his skin. The distant hum of the city continued, but it felt more like a distant melody now, one that had long been a part of him. He looked up at the stars, small pinpricks of light against the vast expanse of dark sky. The stars were distant, yet they held an ancient familiarity, a kind of quiet certainty in their eternal presence. For the first time, Ahmed felt small in the best possible way. He wasn't the center of everything. He didn't need to be. The world was vast, full of mysteries, of stories waiting to be discovered. His own story, his own place in it, was just one small thread in the tapestry of life. And that was enough. He stood up slowly, stretching as he did, feeling the muscles in his legs protest from sitting so long. His body felt lighter, freer. than it had in a long time. He walked down the hill, his pace unhurried, allowing his mind to wander. The world around him was quieter now, the streets less crowded, the noise of the city muffled by the distance. He felt a pull to return home, to the place that had once been his refuge, but now felt like a mere shell of what it used to be. Home, he thought, but the word no longer held the same meaning. It wasn't just a place. Home was something deeper, something he had to rediscover within himself. His phone buzzed again, but he ignored it, the screen lighting up briefly before it dimmed once more. He wasn't ready to engage with the past just yet. Not now. Not while he was still piecing himself back together. He passed by the familiar streets, the buildings standing tall and unyielding, but they no longer seemed imposing. They were just structures, reminders of a life that was behind him. As he continued walking, his thoughts drifted to her once more. He hadn't let go completely, not yet. There were still moments when her image appeared in his mind like a shadow, but now it was different. The pain was no longer sharp. It had softened. He had loved her deeply, but he understood now that love was not about possession. It was about letting go, about allowing the other person the space to grow, to be who they needed to be. He couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't undo the mistakes, but he could change how he moved forward. He paused in front of a small cafe, the warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk, inviting him in. Without thinking, he stepped inside, the door chiming softly as it closed behind him. The barista behind the counter looked up with a friendly smile. "What can I get for you?" Ahmed thought for a moment. Something warm, something simple. "A coffee, please," he said. The barista nodded and began to prepare it, her movements fluid and practiced. The sound of the steam wand and the soft clink of the cups filled the space, grounding him in the present moment. He took a seat near the window, watching as the last of the light drained from the sky, leaving behind the velvet darkness of night. As he sipped the coffee, the bitterness and warmth mingling on his tongue, he realized that he didn't need to have everything figured out. He didn't need to chase answers or seek closure from the past. Life would continue unfolding moment by moment, and he would keep walking with it. When he finished the coffee, he stood up and left a tip on the counter, smiling at the barista as he did. Outside, the city was alive with a quiet hum, the streets less crowded, the air crisp and clean. He felt a deep sense of calm wash over him, the kind of calm that came with acceptance. He wasn't in control of everything, but maybe that was the point. He didn't need to be. Ahmed took one last look at the city around him, the night holding it in a quiet embrace. He didn't know where his path would take him next, but he was no longer afraid. He was ready for whatever came next, knowing that with each step, he was becoming the person he needed to be. And that, in itself, was enough. Ahmed stepped into the quiet of the night, his footsteps soft on the pavement. The cool air wrapped around him, the city lights flickering in the distance like fireflies scattered across the horizon. He didn't have a destination in mind as he walked, but that didn't matter anymore. For the first time in a long while, he felt no rush, no pressing need to be anywhere to achieve anything. He was just walking, just breathing, existing in the moment. As he moved through the streets, the silence between each footstep felt peaceful, as though the world had momentarily slowed down, giving him space to just be. He passed through alleyways and across small bridges, the faint sound of water below as it flowed past the city. It reminded him of the river from earlier. Life, like the river, moved forward, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but it always moved. And just like that, Ahmed realized that he didn't need to force anything anymore. He didn't need to chase answers or obsess over what had been or what would be. He could simply be part of the flow, let things come as they would. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, but he ignored it, not even glancing at the screen. It had been an old habit, always checking, always responding immediately, as if every notification held the key to something important. But now it felt irrelevant. Life wasn't in the notifications. It was in the spaces between them, in the moments where everything slowed and allowed him to simply exist. He stopped in front of a small park, the benches tucked beneath trees, their leaves rustling softly in the night breeze. It was quiet here, the kind of peace that could only be found in a place untouched by the chaos of the world. Without thinking, he sat down on one of the benches, looking up at the sky again. The stars seemed even clearer now, the night sky stretching endlessly above him. He wondered briefly if she ever looked at the stars the way he did. But then he stopped himself. It didn't matter. What mattered was the present. What mattered was the life he had left to live. A figure passed by, a woman walking her dog, the leash jingling softly in the stillness. She smiled at him, a brief, knowing smile, and for a moment, Ahmed found comfort in the simplicity of that connection. He stood up from the bench, his body feeling light, the weight of the world slipping further from his shoulders with each step. The night was his, the city his to explore at his own pace, without expectation. As he walked down the path, he glanced around, taking in the beauty of the quiet world. The buildings, the trees, the stars, the soft hum of the city beyond. It was all a part of the same rhythm, a rhythm he was finally in sync with. He didn't know where the road ahead would take him. But as he walked, he realized something important. It didn't matter. Wherever he went, he would face it with peace, with patience. He would move forward, one step at a time, not in a rush, but at his own pace. The future was an unknown, and that was okay. He didn't need to know everything. What mattered now was the journey, the living, the breathing, the letting go. And with that thought, Ahmed walked on into the night, knowing that whatever came next, he was ready. As Ahmed walked deeper into the night, the city seemed to fade away, the quiet hum of life replaced by the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. The streets felt empty now, the bustle of the day long gone, leaving only shadows and silence. He wasn't sure where he was going, and yet, for the first time, it didn't matter. His steps carried him forward, the rhythm of his walk becoming the only constant in the otherwise still world around him. A sense of calm washed over him, as if the world had paused for him to catch up. The past, the mistakes, the heartbreak, all of it seemed to drift further away with each step, as though the city itself was helping him leave it behind. He passed by an old church, the tall steeple silhouetted against the dark sky, and for a moment he stopped, looking up at it. The old stone structure stood strong and silent, a quiet testament to time. It made him think about the things that endured, the things that lasted. People came and went, lives changed, but there were still some things that remained. And perhaps in time, he would be one of those things, not defined by the past, but by the way he chose to move forward. He continued walking, his thoughts wandering. It was strange how light he felt. A weight he hadn't realized he was carrying was gone, dissolved with the simple act of choosing not to let it define him. His phone buzzed once again, but this time he didn't even flinch. It wasn't urgent. He didn't need to check. In fact, he hadn't needed to check it all evening. It was as if he had stepped out of the constant cycle of notifications, out of the need to stay connected to everything and everyone. And for the first time in a long while, the stillness felt freeing. He looked up, noticing a small cafe in the distance. The soft glow of the lights spilling out from the windows invited him in, and without thinking, he turned toward it. The door jingled softly as he entered, the warmth from inside wrapping around him like a blanket. The barista, a young woman with dark curls and a gentle smile, greeted him as he stepped up to the counter. "Evening," she said. "What can I get you?" Ahmed thought for a moment. Something warm, something simple, a reflection of the peace he felt. "Just a tea," he said, his voice soft. "Something calming." She nodded, moving swiftly to prepare it, her movements smooth and practiced. He took a seat near the window, the soft clink of cups and the quiet hum of conversation around him adding to the peaceful atmosphere. As he waited for his tea, he allowed himself to relax into the space, to breathe in the moment. It was nothing grand, just the simple comfort of a warm drink in a quiet cafe. But in that moment, it felt like everything he needed. The tea arrived, and Ahmed wrapped his hands around the warm mug, feeling the heat seep into his palms. He took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through him, calming his mind further. He looked out the window again, watching the world move outside. But it felt distant now, not in a way that disconnected him, but in a way that reminded him that the world would go on, with or without his involvement. And that was okay. For so long, he had felt like he needed to control everything, to fight against the flow of life. But now, sitting in that quiet cafe, he realized something important. Sometimes, the best thing you could do was to let the current carry you. He didn't need to force anything. Life would unfold on its own, in its own time. And if he could accept that, if he could just be, he would find peace. He smiled softly, a sense of contentment settling over him. He didn't know where this journey was leading, but at this moment it didn't matter. He had everything he needed right here, right now. And that was enough. Ahmed sat in the cafe, the warmth of the tea still lingering in his hands, the steam curling upwards like faint whispers. Outside, the world continued its rhythm, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement, the occasional car passing by with soft hums that seemed distant now. He felt a sense of peace, a strange but welcome stillness that he hadn't experienced in so long. The weight of his past, the pain, the betrayal, it had all been wearing him down for so long. He had been so consumed by the need to fix things, to understand what had gone wrong, that he hadn't allowed himself to simply be. But now, here, in the quiet of this moment, he felt as though he was beginning to let go, not just of her, or the years that had been lost in misunderstanding, but of the idea that life had to be a series of victories, each one leading to something greater. He realized now that the victories weren't always the milestones or the goals. Sometimes they were the moments of silence, the small realizations, the quiet peace he felt right now. His phone buzzed again, an alert, another message from someone he didn't recognize. He hesitated, the familiar compulsion to check it rising, but this time he simply set the phone down on the table. He didn't need to know what it said. Not now. Not when he had already come so far. The woman at the counter smiled at him as she cleaned the counter, and Ahmed returned the smile. It wasn't forced. It wasn't the polite gesture he had often made out of obligation. It was a real smile, one that reflected the quiet contentment he felt inside. He stood up from the table, the warmth from the tea still in his veins, and walked toward the door. The night air greeted him as he stepped outside, cool and crisp against his skin, but not harsh. It was just the air, just another part of the world that was unfolding as it was meant to. As he walked back into the quiet streets, the sound of his footsteps echoed softly, the rhythm steady, like the beat of his own heart. There were no grand epiphanies left to chase, no questions left to answer. He was exactly where he needed to be. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to chase anything anymore. He could just let it all go. And that, he realized, was freedom. Ahmed continued walking through the empty streets, the city now swallowed by the quiet of the night. The soft hum of distant traffic and the rustling of the wind through the trees were the only sounds that accompanied him. Each step felt purposeful, not because he was heading somewhere specific, but because he was finally at peace with himself. For the first time in years, he wasn't burdened by the weight of expectations or by the ghosts of the past. He no longer felt like he was running from something or chasing after something elusive. He had found something simpler, something truer, the ability to just exist, to be in the moment without needing to control or understand everything. He passed by a park, the benches empty under the glow of street lamps. The night air carried the scent of damp earth and fresh grass, and Ahmed inhaled deeply, letting the calm wash over him. There were no answers to be found in the stillness, but there was peace, a quiet, comforting peace that reminded him that sometimes the journey was more important than the destination. His thoughts drifted to her, the woman who had once been the center of his world. He thought of the love they had shared and the ways they had both faltered along the way. But as his mind lingered on the past, he realized something profound. He didn't need closure. He didn't need to understand every detail or question every decision. What mattered was that he had learned, that he had grown, and in doing so, he had freed himself from the shackles of regret. He didn't need to fix anything. He didn't need to change the past. All he needed to do was move forward. As he reached the end of the street, the glow of his apartment building appeared in the distance. But even then, he didn't feel the rush to get back, to step into the familiar confines of his old life. He was different now, lighter, freer. He could return when he was ready. But for now, the city was still his to explore. For the first time in his life, Ahmed felt truly free. Free of the past. Free of the weight of expectation. Free to simply be. And as the stars above twinkled silently in the sky, he realized that sometimes the most profound journeys were the ones that led you right back to yourself. And that was enough.